This is the story of a sentimental journey that began on June 6, 1944, when I boarded a bus in Columbus, Georgia for the ride to Atlanta. There I boarded a train to Clemson, South Carolina for a week's leave in my home in Anderson, South Carolina. I had been reassigned from an infantry basic training regiment at Fort Benning to the 103rd Infantry Division, then stationed at Camp Howze, Texas. As I would find out in a week or so, Camp Howze was almost in the middle of nowhere, near Gainesville, Texas, and about 60 miles northeast of Dallas. As I boarded the bus, I was aware that something big was happening in France. There were no details at that time, but there seemed to be good evidence that the long-awaited invasion of France by the Allied forces was underway. By the time I arrived in Atlanta, this bit of news had been confirmed, and by the time I arrived in Anderson, there was no doubt that June 6, 1944 was indeed D-Day. There was tremendous national apprehension that may have reflected in part the lack of details. By the time I arrived in Anderson, the level of national anxiety was extraordinary. General Eisenhower had come forth with a short statement to confirm the invasion. President Roosevelt had utilized the radio to offer his heartfelt prayer. And it is very likely that on this day there was the greatest degree of prayer and anxiety in this country that there will ever be. By the time I left Anderson a week later, the Allies were ashore in Normandy to stay. We did not know a great amount of detail, but at least the Allied forces had been able to land over 100,000 men the first day, and they had been able to contain whatever counterattacks the Germans had fashioned. I had very mixed feelings about being safely in Anderson while so many American soldiers were risking so much, but I accepted the fact that in the military one goes where he is told to go and does what he is told to do. I had come to realize that so much of what happens relates to what has been called the luck of the draw. In mid-June 1944, I arrived at Camp Howze and reported to Division Headquarters. I was told that I had been assigned to Company A, 410th Infantry Regiment. I learned that the 103rd Division had been activated in October 1942 at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. During the first 3 months that I was in Texas, we all knew that it was a matter of time before we left for overseas, but there was not the slightest clue as to where we would go. Finally, in late September, we boarded a train, and when the train headed east, we realized that we were probably going to Europe. We were processed and outfitted at Camp Shanks outside of New York City. On October 5, 1944, the 410th Infantry Regiment boarded the USS J.R. Brooke, and we steamed out of New York Harbor. We arrived in Marseille on October 20th, 1944. Even as we sailed through the Straits of Gibraltar, we had no idea as to our final destination. It could have been Italy as well as France. Once we arrived in Marseille, we disembarked over the side of the ship via cargo nets and went ashore by landing craft. The harbor was an absolute shambles with ruined docks and sunken ships. Once ashore, we marched about 10 miles to a bivouac area, where we stayed until we loaded up in trucks and began the journey northward. Now, we fast forward by 66 years to August 26, 2010. Once again, I'm on my way to Atlanta, but departing this time from San Francisco. This time, instead of traveling on a Greyhound bus, I'm on a Delta Airlines jet flying at 35,000 feet at 550 miles per hour. After a 4-hour flight, I arrived in Atlanta. There I was to spend 2 days with my grandson and his family, Justin Odell and Jenny Odell, and my great-grandson, Henry Odell, age 2. What a delightful time I had there. And on Saturday, August 28, 2010, Justin and I departed Atlanta on a Delta flight to Paris. This was to be my first return to France. We arrived in Paris at the Charles de Gaulle Airport at 7 a.m. on Sunday, August 29, 2010. As we would find out later, the name of Charles de Gaulle is everywhere. Our driver took us to the Magellan Hotel in Paris. It was conveniently located near the Arc de Triomphe, and by virtue of our early arrival, we were able to spend the entire day sightseeing. Paris has an excellent system of hop-on, hop-off buses, as well as easy-to-use underground and conventional rail systems. The Arc de Triomphe is much larger and more impressive than I had imagined, as is the Eiffel Tower. The tower is a masterpiece of design and construction. The Sunday afternoon crowding did not permit us to ascend the tower, but we enjoyed the view of this edifice from below and as we walked along the Champs-Élysées. We visited Napoleon's tomb and once again marveled at the detail of the construction and architecture. The adjacent military museum was also fascinating. We found the Notre Dame Cathedral to be another awesome example of beauty, architecture, and construction. Most of our second day was spent in the Louvre. The magnificence of the sculptured pieces there was inspiring, as well as the seemingly unlimited amount of other art forms. But this would be a prelude for our visit on the third day to Versailles. There I was amazed at the amount of the acreage there. Again, one cannot imagine the effort that went into the planning, design, and construction of the buildings there, not to mention the landscaping, particularly when one remembers the lack of power tools at that time. Seemingly, there is an unlimited supply of limestone underlying the French countryside, but how in the world the workers quarried and fashioned the stone without power tools defies imagination. In the gardens, there are magnificent plane trees that are kept pruned with the perfect touch. We strolled through the Hall of Mirrors inside the palace, as well as through the other parts of the buildings. In many ways, Paris is a bit overwhelming, and I quite well understood that we simply did not have the time to see very much of this historic city. On September 1st, we departed Paris by rail for the ride to Bayeux and Normandy. We soon appreciated that French trains are very precise and convenient. They arrive and depart exactly on time. They are all electrically powered and are very fast. Our trip to Bayeux was about 2 hours. This quaint old city was a drastic change from Paris. We motored to the Hotel Lion d'Or over very ancient cobblestone streets, and we spent the first afternoon walking about this ancient city. The first point of call was to the Musée de la Tapisserie at Bayeux, where the famous tapestry is displayed. This tapestry, 1.6 feet by 224.3 feet, is a long embroidered cloth that depicts the details leading up to the Norman conquest of England, as well as the events leading up to the invasion itself. The connotation is in Latin. The tapestry tells the story of the Normans led by William the Conqueror, who is the main character, and his defeat of Harold Godwinson, who was the recently crowned King of England, albeit the coronation was by deceit. The tapestry is but another testimonial to the unbelievable patience, persistence, and devotion of those who constructed it. In the course of the afternoon, we strolled the streets of Bayeux. We visited a nearby British military cemetery, a military museum, and the famous Bayeux Cathedral. Walking about this small city minus the Parisian congestion was, in a way, a welcome change. As one connects with ancient history, there is a weird feeling regarding the connection. Many years ago, Roman sanctuaries occupied the present site of the Bayeux Cathedral. The present cathedral was consecrated in July 14, 1077, in the presence of William, Duke of Normandy. Apparently, most of the stained glass windows there today are original. The thought of being on the same site where William the Conqueror stood almost 1,000 years ago is a little spooky, to say the least. On September 2nd, our guide for the Normandy visit presented himself. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver Warman, British Army retired, met us at the hotel. He was completely British in every respect. His father had served in the British Army, and as was the tradition, they served in the same regiment. Oliver was a graduate of Oxford University. His dress included red trousers, a necktie, and a walking cane. His watch band represented his regimental colors. He did not serve in World War II. We began our tour in Oliver's automobile. He had come over from England on a ferry, and we drove first to an area where the British landed. We stood on Bavon Ridge above Ronville at a place where General Erwin Rommel stood in 1944 with his staff officers as they plotted the defensive strategies for the Normandy area. From there we drove to the site of the PEGASUS Bridge. When the original PEGASUS Bridge was replaced in 1994, it was moved to the grounds of the Military Museum, as was one of the large British gliders. The first soldier to be killed in the Normandy invasion was a British lieutenant who was killed as he crossed this bridge. It was a movable type of bridge built in 1934 to cross the Caen Canal between Caen and Ouistreham. This bridge and the Ronville Bridge over the River Orne were major objectives of the British airborne troops. We visited a nearby Canadian military cemetery at Bonny-sur-Mer and then touched briefly at Sword Beach at low tide. That too was an emotional moment. We learned that at low tide a considerable expanse of beach is exposed, and there is a considerable force in the tide that moves laterally and at considerable speed and force sufficient to move any landing force far from the planned site of debarkation. As we moved toward the Omaha Beach area, we visited one of the many military monuments that are there and drove through the very peaceful countryside on the one-lane unpaved roadways. Cows grazed nearby and peacefully in the fields. We walked out to an area above Omaha Beach to a bluff that was the site of one of 12 machine gun emplacements whose fields of fire were the Omaha Beach landing areas that were about 500 yards away. The concrete emplacements and bunkers still remain. We then drove down to Omaha Beach where the tide was still out. History records how deadly this area proved to be for the 1st and the 29th American Infantry Divisions, and how tediously they fought to get off the beach. Of course, there are many, many pictures of this scene with all the ships just off the beach and the beachhead area jammed with men and vehicles. We then drove to the museum and cemetery just behind the Omaha Beach area. Oliver arranged for me to participate in the flag-lowering ceremony at 5 p.m. We met the American superintendent of the ceremony, and as the bugle recording of taps was played, 2 young people and I took the flag and folded it appropriately, and this too was a very emotional moment.
guys.
The cemetery is beautifully designed and maintained. Its symmetry is as striking as is its simplicity. I don't believe that I know anyone who was buried there. Captain Reed Watson from Anderson is buried in the Brittany Cemetery in St. James, France, not too far from Saint-Lô. He served in the 90th Division. The entire day had been a very heartfelt experience, and we ended that day with a delightful dinner at the hotel. The following day was also a very active one. Oliver took us to Port-en-Bessin between Omaha and Gold Beaches and gave us a detailed discussion of the Mulberry Harbor project, and he described in detail how a special 3-inch pipeline had been constructed in England prior to the invasion, and that within a matter of days after the invasion had been laid on the seabed of the 100-mile stretch across the English Channel so that fuel could be pumped across to France. The fuel requirements were tremendous. Apparently, some of these lines came into Port-en-Bessin. We visited Point de Hoc between Omaha and Utah Beaches, where the Ranger Battalion landed and scaled the cliffs, and Utah Beach, where the American 4th Infantry Division came ashore on D-Day. The landing at Utah was not as severely contested as it was at Omaha, such that the 4th Division was able to move quickly inland. We then moved inland to Sainte-Mère-Église. This village was in the middle of the area where the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions landed. In the course of the parachute landings, an American soldier landed on top of the cathedral in Sainte-Mère-Église. He could not descend because his parachute had become attached to the points on the roof of the cathedral. The French people have commemorated this event by placing a parachute and a dummy soldier on the roof of the cathedral. We went inside the cathedral and then drove down to the bridge that crosses the Meurthe River just a short distance outside Sainte-Mère-Église. What now appears to be a lush meadow to the west of the bridge across the Meurthe River at La Fière was an area that the Germans had flooded. But the flooding wasn't apparent on aerial photographs used by these planners of the invasion. Apparently, many of the paratroopers who landed in these flooded areas were drowned because they were heavily loaded down with equipment. On the first few days of the invasion, these two airborne divisions were engaged in deadly combat. We visited the area with the monument that is adjacent to the bridge and where there is a statue to Iron Mike, a statue that has become symbolic of the American infantry soldier. Our final major stop for the day was in Saint-Lô. Although Saint-Lô is only about 22 miles from the Normandy beachhead, it was not until July 18th that the 29th Division captured Saint-Lô. Likewise, the British did not capture Caen until mid-July, and Caen was even closer to the bridgehead. The countryside between Sainte-Mère-Église and Saint-Lô is more rolling and is the so-called bocage countryside where the fields are bordered by the hedgerows that were so troublesomely famous. Generally speaking, the 29th Division followed the road out of Essigny, crossing the Vire and Elle rivers to reach Saint-Lô. A very detailed account of this gigantic effort is recorded in the book Beyond the Beachhead by Joseph Balkowski. The hedgerows that divided the fields greatly favored the defenders and limited the use of tanks. Apparently, this had not been anticipated in the pre-invasion planning. The price paid by the 29th Division from June 6 to July 18th was 2,000 killed and 6,000 wounded out of a division total of 15,000 men. As a comparison, in 7 months, the 103rd Division and the 7th Army sustained about 4,054 casualties total, including 725 dead. Again, the luck of the draw. In St. Lo, we visited the cemetery where nearby much of the fighting was centered. In 1944, the population of St. Lo was only 12,000. In 1999, it was 20,090. We located the spot where Major Thomas Howey was killed on July 18th. He was a native of Abbeville, South Carolina, and was a graduate of the Citadel class of 1935. He was the football coach and a professor at Stanton Military Academy in Virginia when he was called to active duty with the 29th Division. He served on the division staff, but was serving as a battalion commander for the final days of the St. Lo attack. His body was brought into St. Lo and placed on a pile of rubble nearby the church that is adjacent to the cemetery. He is remembered as the Major of St. Lo, and there is a monument in the city square there that is dedicated to his memory, complete with a bust of Major Howey. Again, our being there was a very emotional moment. As we left St. Lo, we drove through the country close to the Martinville Ridge, where so much of the deadly struggle took place. The contrast with the very lovely and peaceful countryside that one sees today makes it difficult to imagine the struggle and sacrifice by the 29th Division as they fought so desperately through this bocage countryside, crossing back and forth over the Vire and Elle rivers. As we completed our tour of Normandy, it was obvious that we could have spent at least another week there, carefully and slowly visiting more of the battlefield areas. As I reviewed our experience in Normandy, I was amazed at the size and scope of this operation. It may very well have been the greatest military endeavor of all time. I was totally unprepared for the total length of the landing areas. From the left flank of the British sector at Sword Beach to the right flank of the American sector at Utah Beach is about 65 miles. This is the equivalent distance from San Jose, California to San Francisco, or from Anderson, South Carolina to Spartanburg. Secondly, it is absolutely astounding that this massive naval armada could have crossed the channel totally undetected. The first person to sight the ships off the Normandy coast was Major Werner Plusket. From his bunker overlooking Omaha Beach, he had repeatedly scanned the horizon during the night. His suspicions that something was happening had been kindled by the news of the Allied paratroop activity. Suddenly, in the early morning hours, he scanned the horizon once more. To his amazement, the scattering, thinning mist on the horizon was magically filling with ships. At once he realized that this was the invasion. Then, thirdly, there was the break in the weather. The forecasters had predicted that there would be a break between storms sufficient for the landing, and this happened. One could also regard this perhaps as the luck of the draw. One additional mind-numbing perception is the fact that the Germans were able to maintain such massive military activity on 3 major fronts at the same time. The requirements for troops in Russia, in Italy, and in France were enormous, not to mention the associated logistical aspects. One cannot help but wonder how much more difficult the Normandy invasion would have been if the Germans had not been fighting the Russians. Our drive back to Bayeux was the end of our tour with Lieutenant Colonel Warman. As we left, we assured him that we were with him on all that he saw, and we could agree on all that we heard. These were two favorite quotes of his. He was a very fine guide. On September 4th, we boarded the train in Bayeux to return to Paris. There was a change of train stations in Paris, and then we were off to Nice. All the French trains seemed to be electrically powered, as was this train that moved along at speeds up to 180 miles per hour. The countryside in the Loire Valley was spectacular, as was the view from the train window for the entire trip. We arrived in Nice precisely on schedule and taxied to our hotel, where we met our velour tour guide, Wilbur Jones, a retired U.S. Navy captain. Also there were the two other members of the tour, Fred Geyer from Albany, New York, and Robert Sterneman from Prescott, Arizona. Both were military history buffs, but neither was a veteran of World War II. In the course of the evening, we had a get-acquainted dinner and then prepared to leave the next day for the trip up the Rhone Valley. On the first day on the Riviera, we visited the landing sites of the 36th, the 45th, and the 3rd Infantry Divisions along the coast, extending some 40 miles from Saint-Raphael to Saint-Tropez. There were monuments at each of these beaches. These landings were much more easily accomplished than were the landings in Normandy. Again, there was total Allied air and naval superiority, and for each of these divisions, this was the 4th or 5th amphibious landing. All three divisions were well experienced in combat in Italy, Sicily, and North Africa. Major General Lucian Truscott, 6th Corps Commander, and Lieutenant General Alexander Patch, 7th Army Commander, were also seasoned veterans. The airborne troops were landed in the vicinity of Lemuy. This part of the invasion was led by Brigadier General Robert Frederick, who had previously commanded the 1st Special Service Force in Italy. The French forces, commanded by General de Lattre, landed just to the west of the 3rd Division in the region of La Cavalière-sur-Mer, and the 1st Special Service Force landed on the two islands of La Hieres just off the coast. By nightfall, the troops were safely ashore and were moving inland. The countryside there is quite mountainous. The basic post-invasion plan called for the French forces to capture Toulon and Marseille as quickly as possible so that the ports would be available as supply bases. General Truscott planned for a task force from the 36th Division, commanded by the Assistant Division Commander General Butler, to begin immediately to move out following the Route de Napoleon to the northwest through Sisteron and Gap, and then to the west to Crest, and on to the area just north of Montélimar. The plan was to trap a large segment of the German army as it attempted to retreat up the Rhone Valley. At this time, there were about 250,000 German troops throughout southern France. On this Sunday, September 5th, we drove to Toulon. The coast is very scenic and very mountainous. In Toulon, we drove to Mount Ferrand for a magnificent view of Toulon and its harbor. The French aircraft carrier, the Charles de Gaulle, was in the harbor at anchor. As might be imagined, the Sunday afternoon automobile traffic was quite heavy everywhere we drove. On Monday, September 6, we drove to the outskirts of Marseille. Quite obviously, the city has grown tremendously since I was there 66 years ago, such that I had no recall even for the hills on the west side, where I spent about 1 week in the hospital awaiting the hospital ship to return to the United States. The heavy traffic deterred us from attempting to see very much of Marseille. Well, we are just outside Marseille at a museum for the French Foreign Legion, We drove into Marseille, tried to get down by the old harbor where I landed in 1944. We could vaguely see the spot, but it's grown up so now it's hard to recognize anything. Thought I recognized the hillside where I may have been in the hospital, but here we are in Aubagne at this French museum. Compare that with when we arrived in 1944 in October, the latter part of October. The harbor was a shambles full of sunken ships and broken docks. We anchored, went over the side of the ship in cargo nets into landing craft, went ashore, lined up, marched straight out of Marseille